Hey there, interwebs. This is part 3 in my increasingly verbose series of replies to Shad and his series Fantasy Rearmed, in which he finds the optimal weapons for fantasy races, and then I politely disagree. As always, watch his series if you haven't already, because it's awesome and this won't make much sense without the context. In this video, I'll address wizards, minotaurs, ophidians, fairies, and skeletons. From this point forward, when I say you, I mean Shad, because this is technically a reply. Wizards. I hemmed and hawed and ummed and erred about doing this one for a while, and I ultimately decided not to. You see, wizard isn't usually depicted as a race, it's a character class. Asking what weapons best suit wizards is like asking what weapons best suit rogues or paladins. If you can have an elf rogue or a dwarf paladin, presumably you could have a centaur wizard. Additionally, wizards are probably the worst class to do this for, since the rules vary so widely between sources. Sometimes they can't wear armor, sometimes they can wear whatever armor they like. Sometimes they can only wear light armor, but they can't have a shield. Some aren't allowed to wield weapons, but some can have a simple staff. Some need to use a wand to focus their chi or whatever, which excludes anything two-handed. I don't think there's much that can be said that applies to most versions, and even less that you haven't already said. Minotaurs. I should admit right now that I love minotaurs. I'm not exactly sure why, but there's just something about these bovine humanoids that rubs me the right way. I even homebrewed an entire Minotaur kingdom for D&D, so I'm biased as hell, but I'll do my best to be even-handed. I also want to start out re-establishing what our parameters of Minotaurs are. Most of the ones I'm familiar with are very strong and very fast while charging, but they're not very smart or agile. For the sake of argument, I'll say they're smart enough to use weapons, determine which ones are best, and possess basic crafting abilities. Maybe making armor is beyond them. Maybe that's why they always seem to be wearing S&M gear. Speaking of impractical armor that shows everyone you're horny, this is the one fantasy race that could justify horned helmets. There's no disadvantage that they aren't already stuck with, although I suppose for them they'd be more like chamfrons. Given their strength advantage, minotaurs are best off wearing whatever armor they can make or acquire. In many ways they're like orcs, as both races tend to be big, strong, and dumb. I stated in part 1 that I believed orcs would most likely take up clubs and smashies as their weapons of choice, and I stand by that for minotaurs. Where the two races differ, aside from horns versus tusks, is that minotaurs are often even stronger and even dumber. A big stick to hit people with is about as uncomplicated as it gets, and provided you've got the strength to make the most of it, that's all you need. Well, maybe it's not all you need, especially if you don't wear armor and aren't made of wood. Yes, I'm talking about shields. Now Shad, you wanted to give them big tower shields, and I like that, but I also like putting spikes on things. Minotaurs need Resident Evil monk shields. There is another kind of shield that would suit them though, one that existed historically, but never saw battlefield use. I'm talking about the judicial combat shield. These massive things often required both hands to use effectively, which is why they were never used in battle, and they were too big and therefore too heavy to carry around just in case. Bucklers these ain't. They'd only have a place where you knew you'd be fighting someone in single combat, so they were limited to judicial duels. There are illustrations which show them being used with a weapon in one hand, but in all of those cases the shield is being rested on the ground. If you have fantastic strength though, not only could you carry one around with you, you might even be able to use it like a normal shield in one hand, and unlike tower shields, these often had hooks and spikes for tripping or disarming and skewering your foes. They're a weapon in their own right, which makes the big club just gravy. Whoops, I misread that. I meant to say the big club just makes you gravy. The real question, though, is about female minotaurs. Teats or tits? Snake people. These have many names, such as Nagas and Lamias, but Nagas and Lamias mean different things in different places, so I'm going to call these creatures Ophidians to be clear. First of all, I have to disagree about weaponized constriction. As I understand it, when a constrictor is killing its prey, it isn't squeezing the whole time. It tightens, then holds that by friction and the natural strength of the coils, if that makes sense. The boa constrictor also doesn't asphyxiate its prey. It stops the flow of blood around the body, causing death much faster. These things considered, I don't believe Ophidians would have the great strength and endurance you ascribe to them. A mighty squeeze from a giant snake might not even be a death blow to someone in a well-made plate cuirass. Furthermore, if someone's planning to attack an Ophidian, this is the one time impractical fantasy spiked armor would actually be a wise decision. You don't even need them all over. Just stick a bunch out of the way on your back like a blue shell and you're golden. As I said, I like putting spikes on things. Speaking of armor for the snake person might protect them from skewering themselves on the spikes, but they'd never get that far in the first place. Snakes have specialized scales on their undersides which allow them to slither. Wearing full-body mail as you recommended would be like trying to run with your legs tied together, and this could justify why you so often see them only armored on top. because they need the rest unarmored to move. Maybe some plates down the back would still allow movement, but those wouldn't protect against spiked armor during constriction. Some versions, though, give their scales much greater defensive capabilities, so they have natural armor and don't need extra. If we do accept that their underbelly must remain uncovered but does not have particularly resistant scales, suddenly rearing up to great heights is unwise as well. They'd be exposing a huge, relatively unprotected target, and with human-length arms they wouldn't even be able to get their shield, if they had one, low enough to defend. Maybe if they had a very long kite shield. Nah. One big point we've ignored so far relates to their physiology, and that's whether or not they're cold-blooded. Cold-blooded animals, also known as ectotherms, rely on their environment to take in energy. When they get cold, their metabolism slows and they become lethargic and sluggish to conserve energy. Most ectotherms are also ambush predators rather than aggressive hunters. If ophidians are cold-blooded, they probably have poor stamina, and if their body temperature is too low, they'd be very slow in a fight. If they're warmed up and ready for one, though, I do agree that lashing out is a solid strategy. Their size and length can be quite varied, and the lunge distance is proportional to their size. On average, most snakes can lunge about a third of their body length. When we look at ophidians, most tend to stand about the same height as a human, and the upright portion of their body is about a third of the total length. A full lunge for a human is about one body length. From this, we can say that an ophidian has roughly the same lunging reach as a person. When I think combat lunges, my mind goes to the rapier, but rapiers are heavy and require a lot of stamina, so perhaps a more economical choice would be the smallsword for quick lunge and recover style attacks. You most often see ophidians armed with curved swords, as you pointed out, but I suspect the reason for that is mostly artistic. These blades have a nice serpentine curve to them, just like their wielders. The other alternatives are the long sword and the spear. The latter has the advantage of being able to be used with a shield, and if you're primarily thrusting, the advantages of a long sword are less useful. Ophidians are also commonly depicted as having or using venom. Although I think biting directly is an unwise tactic, using venom on the ends of their weapons could be quite prudent with the stick-and-move attack style. One could lunge in, deliver the venom, and recoil quickly, and then the fight is just evading until their opponent is dead or too weak to fight back. Lastly, with ranged weapons, I don't think the bow is a great choice if they're cold-blooded and lack the persistent strength. They'd be much better off using crossbows with windlasses or cranakins and then waiting for an opportunity. Crossbows are much better suited to that ambush predator mentality, since one can wait at the ready indefinitely. It's much more economical with their metabolism. In summary, their physiology prohibits armor below the waist, but they definitely want upper body armor and a shield. On the other hand, they'd be wise to hold a spear tipped with venom, and keep a crossbow handy. Their biological strength and weaknesses favor ambushes. In many ways, they're like another human from the waist up animal hybrid, the Arachnian. I already made a whole video about them, so go watch that. Anyone wishing to fight an ophidian should come at night when it's more sluggish and wear spiky armor of obvious villainy. Fairies. This is another case where I basically agree with everything you said, but disagree on a key detail, namely, speed. Exact size varies, but fairies are usually no bigger than a small bird. We also see them hovering and flying backwards, and the only birds that can do that are hummingbirds. In wind tunnels, hummingbirds have been observed flying at speeds of up to 15 meters per second, or 34 miles an hour. That's quick, but this isn't Fairy Allen. I haven't been able to find a whole lot of reliable information on the subject, but what I have found indicates that the tip of a longsword during a swing moves at speeds which are about the same, and we can parry those. You said that fairy swords could be much larger than the fairies themselves due to the square cube law greatly reducing the weight, but it's important to remember the fairies weigh next to nothing as well. In fact, a 6-inch tall fairy would weigh about 46 grams. A 3-inch tall fairy weighs only 6 grams. A US penny weighs a whopping 2.5 grams. This box cutter blade weighs 1.9 grams. A 30-centimeter needle, 2 millimeters in diameter, would weigh about 7.5 grams. You pointed out in the Buster Sword video that a person needs to weigh much more than any sword they're using to overcome its inertia. Even if a 3-inch fairy's sword weighed only 1.5 grams, that'd still be a quarter of their own weight. The imbalance would only be exacerbated by the leverage of such a long object, and this would probably interfere with the fairy's ability to fly. For a small fairy, by the time a sword is small enough to be wieldable, it'd be ineffective. I'd like to pause now and tell a little story. Once upon a time, my friends and I were hanging out on the back porch, and a carpenter bee was harassing us. After a while, we got sick of it, and one of my friends grabbed a foam LARP weapon that was nearby, because that's the kind of geeky people we are. She swung that thing into the bee like a baseball bat. A thunderous crack followed, and the bee shot across the yard in the blink of an eye. I was astounded it survived long enough to fly off in a dazed spiral. True, an annoying bee and a sapient creature trying to kill you are very different, but consider the situation as a fairy. If I'm highly mobile and fighting something so large it could likely kill me with naught but a solid backhand, I'm not going to use my mobility to get closer to it. What about armor, though? Previously in the series, we've discussed how the square cube law benefits smaller folk like dwarves and hobbits since they have less surface area. The same must be true for fairies too, right? Wrong. Armor worked for dwarves and hobbits because even though they were smaller, they were still fairly strong. A fairy is so small that the armor for one wouldn't be thick enough to be effective. If it were, it'd make the fairy too heavy to fly, costing them their one advantage, just like it did with other winged humanoids. If you're a fairy, don't rely on armor or speed. Don't get close. Melee weapons are out. Smaller animals fight big ones in nature, though, so how do they do it? They use either numerical superiority, venom, or both. If I'm a smart little fairy, I want both, so what ranged weapons will my friends and I use to deliver our venom? It's true that a fairy can draw a proportionally stronger longbow than a human, but it'd still be much weaker by the numbers. Additionally, the problem dwarves had with bows was reduced draw length. For fairies, this is even worse, since their draw length would be only a few inches. Todd of Todd's Workshop made a balistrino with a similar draw length, and to have any power at all, the draw weight was 145 kilos, or 320 pounds, and required the use of a screwjack to span it. Even this titanic draw weight failed to achieve any great penetration factor, barely piercing a 3mm wooden plank. He described it himself as, quote, an executive toy. My point is, fairies just aren't large or strong enough to use effective longbows. They'd have to use fairy-sized windlass crossbows with envenomed bolts and aim for gaps in their enemy's armor, and having multiple comrades wouldn't hurt their chances. If melee combat is virtually suicide and ranged combat is borderline useless, what hope do fairies actually have? On the other hand, what hope do humans have? I also find the question fascinating of what weapons could humans use against fairies, besides the aforementioned LARP weapons, obviously. Traditional folklore tells us fair folk are susceptible to cold iron, though what cold iron specifically is depends on whom you ask, and I made a whole video examining the idea. You'd also have to hit the fairies with it to be effective. A custom fairy hunting weapon I can see is essentially a modified cricket bat with a whole bunch of iron nails bunged through the back side. It'd be crude, but fairly effective in my opinion. Still, not as effective as what's been mentioned elsewhere, the almighty flamethrower. Although I subscribe to the ancient maxims of kill it with fire and no kill like overkill, giant balls of cleansing flame may be a bit much, especially if you don't want to burn down the whole forest with them. There is another saying, where there's smoke, there's fire. This isn't strictly true, but smoke is worth considering. Humans have used it for ages to exterminate insects and other pests by suffocating them. There are also plants like eucalyptus and mint whose smoke is a natural pesticide but harmless to us. Humans might start spraying for fairies, or they could go full Great War on the fair folk and gas whole sections of the forest. Speaking of insecticides, I'd like to go back to bees for a moment. What's the best tactic for a human to use against a swarm of angry bees, assuming they don't have a flamethrower handy? It's covering every bit of exposed skin and running away very fast. That's a victory for the bees. Bees don't hunt, though. Their attacks are just defending their home. Even wasps aren't that aggressive, and they're assholes. All things considered, I have to conclude that the question of what's the best weapon for a fairy is strictly academic. I mean, more so than usual for this series. Everyone would know that if you leave fairies alone, they'll leave you alone. Skeletons. The first thing I want to address is physiology. They're usually depicted with human levels of strength, but since they weigh so much less, you reasoned they can move faster, jump higher, etc. But can they? With dwarves, giants, snake people, and even centaurs, they all had anatomy that was at least plausible. There's no way skeletons should be able to move without magic, so trying to make scientific extrapolations feels like trying to make a house of cards in a swimming pool. There's just no solid foundation to build on. Nevertheless, I shall soldier on. There are two big things to consider when we talk about skeletons, and you pointed both of them out. They weigh very little, and they don't tire or get muscle fatigue. The low weight is actually a problem simply because it limits what weapons they can use. Swinging a sword requires you to overcome its inertia using your own. Newton's third law of motion. When you exert a force on an object, it exerts an equal force back on you. A human can swing a soberly proportioned sword because it weighs so little compared to us, but ridiculous anime swords would throw us around like ragdolls. An athletic 80-kilo adult has only a 12-kilo skeleton. That's a big problem on its own. They could remedy this by adding more weight, like attaching large rocks or sandbags inside the rib cage and core to bulk up. Without organs, the chest cavity is just wasted space anyway. Come to think of it, if they do this, they'd be able to swing their weapons so much faster because all of their weight is in their core. Imagine that. Yajutsu skeletons. They could also wear heavy armor. You said 85-kilo armor would make them too heavy to move, but I disagree. It follows simple logic. Whenever we pick something up, part of our strength goes to lifting the weight of our arm. A human is strong enough to fight with 12 kilos of skeleton, 68 kilos of meat, and 25 kilos of armor. A A skeleton is equally strong, but is missing the 68 kilos of meat. Therefore, the weight of the armor a skeleton could wear is equal to the weight of the armor a human could wear, plus 85% of the weight of the human. It'd be this impenetrable undead tank. The thing that usually balances heavy weapons and armor out is fatigue, but as we've already established, skeletons don't tire. Heavy armor doesn't slow you down to a crawl or stop you from getting up if you're knocked over, as some people believe, but it can get exhausting. If we look at history, soldiers on campaign often wore less armor than knights in a tournament. This is because wearing and fighting heavy armor can get very tiring very quickly, but if you're expecting a fight, like a knight in a tournament would be, you make that sacrifice for protection. Tournaments were also over relatively quickly with time to rest. This is why tournament armor was often the heaviest and most protective armor of its day. Full plate weighed about 25 to 30 kilos, but jousting armor could weigh up to 50, and why stop there? For a 12-kilo skeleton with a 10-kilo sandbag, an 80-kilo suit would be just the thing. Also, unlike large weapons, inertia isn't a concern because the armor is acting against itself since it's evenly distributed. The skellies would physically be similar in strength, weight, and agility to a normal person, but much tougher. Historically, once armor got to a certain point, weapons adapted to smash into it or stab into the gaps around it. Smashing through extra thick plates is a fool's errand, and guess what attacks are useless against skeletons? Stabs! Now we've got borderline invincible enemies with limitless stamina. At this point, it doesn't really matter what weapons the skellies have. They could beat you to death with rubber chickens if they wanted. It'd take a while, but it's not like they've got anything better to do. They're skeletons. To put it less facetiously, if you have creatures the same size and weight as humans, with roughly human levels of ability, then any human weapon will work as well for them. Which one they pick at this point is more dependent on the context of the fight than their own physiology. Still, we can say that since they're wearing super tough armor, they needn't bother with a shield and can use a two-handed weapon, just like humans did historically. There is one two-handed weapon that I think would be better suited to a skelly than a human, and that is the bardiche. The bardiche is a descendant of the Dane axe, and somewhere between a short polearm and a long axe. It saw most of its use in the northern and eastern parts of Europe, and despite being a great chopper, I understand it never really took off because its considerable mass made it tiring in extended use. As we've already established though, skeletons don't tire, so this weapon suits them quite well. Optimized skeletons in brief: big armor, big axe, big problem. Lastly, I have to make some follow-ups. My praiseworthy qualities are truly innumerable, but they don't include humility or the ability to remember relevant facts when I'm writing these damn scripts. In the Tree People video, I said that their ideal weapon is a big crossbow. Taking that one step further, I'd say it's the gastrophetes, which was spanned by placing its tip on the ground, bracing the butt against your stomach, hence the name, and walking forward. The bigger you were, the stronger a bow you could span just by using your own body weight, so imagine the potential for an ent. Next, when discussing centaurs, I said that I didn't know any historical examples of a two-handed mace. Right after uploading, I remembered that the Chinese Wolf's Tooth Club and the Japanese Kanebo Tetsubo both fit the bill of two-handed smashy stick. That's everything about covered, so I'll end this video here. If you want more of these videos or more of my writing, why not show your interest by reading one of my ebooks linked in the description. Speaking of supporting your artists, some of the artwork I used in this video was created by Lauren Draws, Jet, Blasbarus, Flowerthorn, Solifine, Brian Kessinger, It's Horrible, and Fami Hamke, so go check out their pages linked in the description. Thanks for the support, and have a nice day.